Maybe try speaking proper English next time, Richard Cole said, his voice smooth but edged with something colder, as he flicked a folded $20 bill onto the polished oak table without looking at her, and the men around him laughed, not loud at first, just a ripple, a shared smirk, the kind that spreads when no one wants to be the only one not amused, and Ava Brooks stood there with the tray balanced in her left hand, her right fingers still resting lightly against the rim of a half-filled water glass, the condensation cool against her skin, her posture straight, her expression neutral, as if she had learned long ago how to let moments pass through her without leaving visible marks. But the laughter lingered, stretching just a second too long, echoing against the high ceiling of the private dining room where soft amber lights reflected off crystal glasses and silver cutlery, where deals worth more than she would earn in a lifetime were discussed between bites of steak and sips of aged bourbon, and she could feel their eyes on her now, not as a person, not even as staff, but as something closer to background noise that had accidentally spoken out of turn, and still she didn't move, didn't react, because reacting would mean stepping into their world on their terms, and that was something she had learned not to do, not anymore, not after everything it had cost her before, and so she simply inhaled once, slow and controlled, the faint scent of grilled meat and expensive cologne mixing in the air, and lowered the water glass gently onto the table with a soft, precise click that somehow cut cleaner than any raised voice could have. But the man to Richard's left leaned back in his chair, chuckling, mimicking her earlier, "Yes, sir," under his breath with exaggerated politeness, drawing another round of quiet amusement, and Richard didn't stop it, didn't even glance at her again, already turning his attention back to the documents spread in front of him. Thick stacks of paper clipped neatly, numbers and clauses and signatures waiting to be finalized, his pen resting just above the page as if the world itself paused for his decision, and Ava's eyes, despite herself, flickered downward for the briefest moment, catching a line of text she wasn't meant to see, a company name she recognized instantly, the letters sharp and unmistakable, tightening something deep in her chest before she could stop it. And just like that, the room seemed to narrow, the laughter fading into the background as memory pressed forward. Hospital hallways, late-night phone calls, her mother's voice trying to sound strong even when it wasn't, and she straightened almost imperceptibly, the tray steady in her hand, her heartbeat measured but louder now in her ears, because this wasn't just another table, another group of men, who would forget her the second she walked away. This was something else, something that reached beyond this room, and into places she couldn't ignore, and for a second, just a second, she considered saying nothing, stepping back, letting it go the way she had let so many things go before, but her gaze lingered on that page, on that single line that didn't sit right, that felt wrong in a way she couldn't unsee, and the silence between the laughter stretched thinner, sharper, like the moment before. Something breaks, and though no one noticed it yet, though the men at the table were still smiling, still certain of their control, something had already shifted, quietly, invisibly, in the space between them and the woman they had just laughed at. Ava did not speak, not yet, because speaking had consequences, and she had learned that lesson long before tonight. Learned it in quiet classrooms where her answers were always just a little too precise. Learned it in offices where her resume was glanced at and then set aside. Learned it in the long, sterile hallways of St. Matthew's Medical Center, where she spent her mornings now, sitting beside her mother's bed with a folded notebook in her lap, pretending to read while machines hummed softly. In the background, measuring time in steady, indifferent beeps, and every dollar she earned from double shifts at the restaurant stretched thin across bills that never seemed to shrink, prescriptions with names too long to pronounce, consultations that always ended with the same careful tone, the same phrases about options and timelines, and she had nodded through all of it, absorbing, calculating, surviving, because that was what she did best. She endured, she adapted, she stayed quiet when quiet was the safer choice. But before all of that, before the uniform and the tray and the practiced invisibility, there had been a different version of her, one who sat in lecture halls with casebooks open and highlighters lined neatly across the desk, one who argued points of contract law with a certainty that made professors pause, one who believed that understanding the fine print could change the outcome of entire lives. And that version of Ava had not disappeared, It had only been set aside, folded carefully like something too valuable to throw away, but too heavy to carry every day. And now, standing in that private dining room with the soft glow of chandelier light reflecting off glass and polished wood, she felt it again, that instinct, that quiet pull towards something that did not sit right. Because the name on that document was not just a name, it was the company where her mother had worked for nearly 2 decades before a sudden restructuring had left her without insurance, without stability, without the safety net that had once seemed guaranteed. And Ava remembered the night her mother came home with a cardboard box instead of her usual tired smile, remembered the way she tried to make it sound temporary, like something that would resolve itself if they just waited long enough. And they had waited, but things had only unraveled further from there. And now that same company name sat on a page in front of a man who had just dismissed her with a careless comment and a flick of his wrist. A man whose signature could finalize whatever was written in those clauses without ever feeling the ripple effects beyond profit margins. And quarterly reports. And Ava's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the tray, not enough for anyone to notice, just enough to ground herself in the moment. As the conversation at the table continued without her, voices low and confident, discussing timelines and acquisitions as if they were moving pieces on a board rather than decisions that would land in real lives, in real homes, in places like hers. And she shifted her weight subtly, still positioned just within reach of the table. Close enough to hear, close enough to see the page when Richard adjusted the document, exposing more of the text for a brief second. And there it was again, the clause, buried deep, written in language designed to glide past the untrained eye. But she caught it instantly, the phrasing too broad, the liability too one-sided, the kind of detail that could be overlooked until it was too late. And her breath slowed as her mind began to map it out piece by piece, connecting what she saw now to everything she had studied before, everything she had once been. And for the first time since she had stepped up to the table, she was no longer just a waitress holding a tray. She was something else entirely, something the room had not accounted for, even if no one realized it yet. Richard Cole adjusted the cuff of his tailored sleeve with a slow, deliberate motion, the kind that carried more authority than any raised voice. And the conversation at the table shifted subtly around him, as if the room itself recalibrated to his presence, his approval, his next word, because this was his space, his deal, his outcome to control, and every man seated around that table understood it without needing to be told. Their posture slightly angled toward him, their laughter quieter now, more measured, waiting for his cues before reacting again. And Richard leaned back just enough to scan the document in front of him, his pen tapping once against the margin in a soft, rhythmic sound that filled the silence left behind by fading amusement. And though his eyes moved across the page with practiced confidence, there was no hesitation in him, no second guessing. Only the expectation that everything placed before him had already been vetted, already approved, already safe, because men like him did not have time to question every detail. They relied on systems, on teams, on layers of expertise designed to ensure that nothing slipped through. And that belief had carried him through decades of deals that built his empire, acquisitions measured not just in numbers, but in entire industries reshaped under his signature. And tonight was no different. Or at least it was not supposed to be. As he glanced briefly toward the man seated across from him, a polished executive with a confident smile that did not quite reach his eyes, the kind of smile that suggested everything was under control while quietly avoiding anything that was not. And Richard had seen that look before, had trusted it before, because trust in rooms like this was often transactional, built on reputation rather than verification, and he accepted it now without question, because why would he not? The numbers aligned. The projections were strong. The opportunity was clear, and the only interruption so far had been a waitress who did not seem to understand her place, and he dismissed that thought just as quickly as it came, his attention returning fully to the page as he lifted the pen slightly higher, poised at the edge of commitment, while beside him one of his partners leaned in, lowering his voice just enough to sound discreet while still being heard, making a passing comment about closing timelines and market positioning, reinforcing the momentum already building in the room, the subtle pressure to finalize, to move forward, to not overcomplicate what appeared to be a straightforward win. And across the table another man nodded, adding a quiet agreement that echoed the same confidence, the same assurance that everything was exactly as it should be, and Richard gave a small nod in return, acknowledging the consensus without breaking his focus, because consensus was what sealed deals like this, not doubt, not hesitation, and certainly not the input of someone who had been standing silently at the edge of the table moments ago. And yet, despite all of that, despite the certainty surrounding him, there was something else now, something faint but present, like a subtle shift in air pressure before a storm, not visible, not loud, but enough to be felt if one paid close attention. And though Richard did not consciously register it, his pen did not touch the paper just yet, hovering there for a fraction longer than necessary, as if something unseen had interrupted the final step. And behind that pause, just within the quiet margins of the moment, Ava remained exactly where she was, still, composed, watching not the man, but the document, because she already knew what he did not. And in a room built on certainty, she was the only one who could see the crack forming beneath it. Ava felt the moment stretch to its limit, thin as glass and just as fragile, and she knew with a quiet certainty that if she let it pass, it would be gone for good, buried under signatures and handshakes and polite congratulations that would echo long after the consequences had already begun. And her grip on the tray steadied as she took a small step forward, not enough to disrupt the room, just enough to enter it, to exist within it in a way that could no longer be ignored. And her voice, when it came, was calm, controlled, and clear. "Sir, you might want to take another look at Section 12. And the words did not rise above the room. They did not demand attention, but they cut through it anyway, precise and deliberate, like a single note played in perfect pitch. And for a brief second, no one reacted, as if the sentence itself needed time to be processed, to be placed into a context that made sense. Because it did not belong coming from her, not from someone holding a tray, not from someone who had been the subject of laughter moments ago. And then the reaction came, not as silence, but as dismissal, a low chuckle from the man on Richard's right, followed by another voice, sharper, edged with irritation, "Excuse me." And a few heads turned now, not toward the document, but toward Ava, their expressions shifting from amusement to mild annoyance, as if she had interrupted something important. Without permission, and Richard finally looked up, his gaze settling on her for the first time with full attention, not curious, not interested, but assessing, the way one might look at a problem that should not exist. And his eyes flicked briefly to the tray in her hand, then back to her face, measuring, categorizing, and dismissing all at once. And his voice, when he spoke, was quiet but firm. "This is not your concern." And it landed with the weight of authority, the kind that expected compliance without question. And around the table, the energy shifted again, the earlier laughter replaced now by something tighter, more controlled, a collective agreement that the interruption needed to be corrected, that the order of the room needed to be restored. And one of the executives leaned back with a smirk, shaking his head slightly as he added, "I think we are fine without legal advice from the waitstaff," drawing a few restrained laughs that carried more edge than humor this time. And still Ava did not move back, did not apologize, because she had already crossed the line that separated silence from consequence. And there was no returning to the safer side of it now. And she met Richard's gaze without defiance, without challenge, just steady, as if the truth she held was enough to stand on its own. "It shifts full liability," she said, her tone unchanged. "If anything goes wrong after the acquisition, your company takes the loss, not theirs." And this time the words did something different. They did not disappear into the air. They landed. And though no one admitted it yet, though no one spoke immediately, there was a pause, subtle but undeniable, as a few eyes drifted back toward the document, not out of belief, but out of instinct, the same instinct that recognizes risk before it is fully understood. And Richard's pen, still hovering above the page, did not move, not forward, not away, just suspended in place as the room balanced between dismissal and doubt. And Ava stood there, no longer invisible, no longer background, but the only person in the room who was not guessing. The pause did not last long, because doubt in a room like this rarely stayed unchallenged for more than a second. And the man across the table let out a short laugh, sharper this time, more deliberate, as if to reassert control over a moment that had begun to slip. "That is not how this is structured," he said, tapping the document lightly with 2 fingers, his confidence returning in a practiced rhythm. "The liability is balanced across both parties," and a few heads nodded immediately, not because they had verified it, but because agreement felt safer than uncertainty, and Richard's gaze remained fixed on Ava, his expression tightening just slightly, not in anger yet, but in irritation, the kind that builds when something minor refuses to resolve itself, and his voice lowered, controlled. "You have said enough," he stated, each word measured, leaving no space for interpretation. And for a moment it seemed that would be the end of it, the natural correction of an imbalance, the restoration of hierarchy, and the room leaned into that expectation, waiting for Ava to step back, to apologize, to disappear again into the background where she belonged in their version of reality. But she did not move, and that stillness, that refusal to retreat, began to draw more attention than her words ever had, and one of the executives exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair with a faint shake of his head. "This is getting inappropriate," he muttered, loud enough for others to hear, reinforcing the idea that she had crossed a line that should not have been crossed, and a subtle shift of chairs followed, bodies adjusting, distancing themselves from the disruption as if proximity alone might implicate them in it. And Richard set his pen down now, not signing, not yet, but no longer holding it in suspension, placing it beside the document with a soft but decisive sound that carried more weight than his earlier words, and he turned his attention fully toward Ava, his posture straightening, his presence filling the space in a way that made it clear who held authority here. "Manager," he called without raising his voice, and almost immediately, movement stirred at the edge of the room, a figure approaching quickly but carefully, aware that whatever had unfolded here needed to be handled with precision, and Ava could feel the shift, the moment tightening around her, consequences beginning to take shape, because this was how it worked, not through confrontation, but through removal, through quiet correction that erased the problem without acknowledging it. And still, even with that knowledge, even with the weight of it pressing against her, she held her ground, because stepping back now would not undo what she had seen, would not change what was written on that page, and her voice, when she spoke again, did not rise, did not challenge, but it carried something deeper, something anchored in certainty rather than defiance. "It is not balanced," she said, her eyes moving briefly to the document, then back to Richard. "The language in subsection C overrides the shared liability in subsection A. It transfers full responsibility after closing, and the specificity of it landed differently, sharper, harder to dismiss as guesswork, and though no one spoke immediately, though no one acknowledged it out loud, there was a visible hesitation now, a fracture in the earlier confidence, and the man who had laughed first glanced down at the page, just for a second, then back up again as if to deny the impulse. But it had already happened, the seed of doubt planted where certainty had stood before, and the manager's footsteps slowed as he neared the table, sensing that this was no longer a simple interruption to resolve, but something more complicated, something that had begun to shift the balance of the room in a way no one had expected, least of all the people who believed they controlled it. The manager stopped just short of the table, his presence hovering at the edge of the moment like a question waiting to be answered, but no one spoke to him. No one gave the signal to proceed, because something had shifted in a way that made immediate action feel premature, and the room, once filled with quiet confidence and controlled conversation, now held a different kind of silence, one that pressed gently against every surface, soft but undeniable, and Ava could hear it in the absence of movement, in the way no glass was lifted, no chair adjusted, no voice rose to fill the space. And for the first time since she had stepped forward, she allowed herself to breathe fully, slow and steady, her shoulders relaxed, her grip on the tray loosening just enough to remind her that she was still grounded, still present, still here, and the light above cast a warm glow across the table, catching the edge of the document where the ink had not yet met the page, where a decision still waited to be made. And Richard's hand rested beside it now, no longer in motion, his fingers still, his posture unchanged, but his focus different, no longer dismissing, no longer immediate, but considering, even if only slightly, even if only enough to delay what had seemed inevitable moments ago. And across from him, the executive who had spoken with such certainty before shifted in his seat, his confidence not gone but quieter, less absolute, as if something in the air had unsettled it. And one by one, almost imperceptibly, eyes began to return to the document, not openly, not in full acknowledgement, but in small, cautious glances, the kind that happen when doubt enters a room without permission. And Ava did not speak again, did not push further, because she understood this part too, the space between words where truth either takes root or disappears, and she stood there in that space, silent, her presence no longer an interruption but a constant, something that could not be undone by simply ignoring it. And in her mind, the noise of the restaurant beyond the private room faded completely, replaced by a memory just as quiet, the soft hum of hospital lights, the steady rhythm of machines, her mother's hand resting lightly in hers, fragile but warm, and the promise she had made without saying it out loud, that she would not let things happen to them without understanding why, without at least trying to see what others missed. And that promise settled into her now, not as pressure, but as calm, as clarity, and she let the silence hold, let it stretch just enough for the weight of her words to settle where they needed to, not forced, not repeated, just present. And somewhere in that stillness, the manager took a step back, not dismissed, not called away, but simply no longer needed in that immediate second, because this was no longer about removing a disruption. It was about something deeper, something unfolding beneath the surface of a deal that had felt certain until it was not. And the room, for all its power and control, waited without admitting that it was waiting, balanced on the edge of a truth that had not yet been fully revealed but could no longer be ignored. Richard reached for the document again, slower this time, as if the paper itself had changed weight, and his fingers pressed lightly against the edge before he pulled it closer, the faint sound of it sliding across polished wood cutting through the silence like a quiet decision being made. And without a word he flipped back a few pages, his eyes narrowing slightly as he scanned the dense lines of text, no longer skimming, no longer trusting the structure he had assumed was solid. And across from him the executive who had spoken with such confidence leaned forward as well, his posture tightening, his earlier ease replaced by a subtle tension that showed in the way his jaw set, in the way his hand hovered just above the table, as if unsure whether to intervene or stay still. And no one else spoke, not because they had nothing to say, but because something more important was happening now, something that demanded attention over conversation. And Richard's gaze moved with precision, line by line, until it stopped, just for a fraction longer than the rest. And in that moment the room seemed to contract, the air pulling inward as if waiting for confirmation of what had only been a possibility seconds ago. And he shifted slightly, angling the page toward the light, reading it again, slower, more deliberate. And then his pen, which had been resting beside the document, rolled slightly as his hand brushed against it, the small movement echoing louder than it should have in the stillness. And across the table, one of the men cleared his throat softly, the sound uncertain, no longer confident enough to fill the space. And Richard did not look up, did not acknowledge anyone else, because what he was seeing now was no longer something he could dismiss. The phrasing exactly as Ava had said, the subsection buried beneath layers of language that softened its impact, but did not remove it. And, once seen, it could not be unseen. And the realization did not come as a dramatic shift, not as shock, but as something quieter and heavier, a recalibration of certainty. And he leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose as his eyes lifted from the page and moved, not to the executive across from him, not to the others at the table, but to Ava, standing exactly where she had been, unchanged, steady. And for the first time since she had spoken, there was no dismissal in his gaze, no irritation, only a measured acknowledgement that something had been missed and that she had seen it. And the executive across from him felt it too. The shift, because he spoke quickly now, his tone controlled but edged with urgency. "It is a standard clause. It does not apply in practice," he said, gesturing lightly toward the document, as if the explanation alone could restore what had been lost. But the words did not land the same way they had before, because the foundation beneath them had already cracked. And Richard did not respond immediately, did not accept the explanation, did not reject it either, just let it sit there, suspended, while his attention remained fixed on the woman they had all overlooked. And in that silence, the power in the room shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably, because the certainty that had once belonged entirely to one side was no longer whole, and Ava, still holding the tray, still composed, was now at the center of it without ever raising her voice. No one moved to sign anything anymore, and that alone said more than any argument could have, because in a room built on momentum, hesitation was the first sign of collapse, and Richard let the silence sit for a moment longer before he finally spoke, not loudly, not sharply, but with a measured tone that carried a different kind of weight now. "Walk me through it," he said, his eyes still on Ava, and the words landed with a quiet authority that shifted the entire dynamic of the room, because he was not addressing his legal team, not the executive across from him, but her, the woman who had been invisible less than 5 minutes ago, and the executive straightened immediately, a flicker of resistance crossing his face. "There is no need for that," he interjected quickly, a hint of urgency threading through his voice. "We can clarify internally." But Richard did not look at him, did not acknowledge the interruption, his attention steady, unwavering, and for a brief second Ava remained still, not out of uncertainty, but because moments like this were rare, fragile, easily broken if handled carelessly, and she placed the tray down gently on the side table beside her, the soft clink of glass against wood grounding the shift that had already begun, her hands now free, her posture unchanged, calm, composed, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same quiet clarity as before. Subsection A presents shared liability. She began, her gaze moving briefly to the document, then back to Richard. But subsection C redefines post-closing responsibility using broader language that overrides the earlier terms. And as she spoke, she stepped slightly closer to the table, not intruding, but close enough to indicate the exact line, her finger hovering just above the page without touching it, respectful of the boundary yet precise in direction. "Right here," she said, and Richard followed her indication immediately, his eyes tracking the line, while the executive across from him shifted again, his confidence thinning. "That is standard phrasing," he insisted, but the conviction behind it was no longer solid, no longer absolute, and Ava continued without raising her voice, without pushing, simply laying out what was already there. "It allows the acquiring party to assume full liability for any undisclosed risks discovered after closing, regardless of prior disclosure limitations," she said, each word deliberate, each phrase anchored in understanding rather than assumption, and the room listened, not because they had chosen to, but because they could not ignore it anymore, and Richard leaned forward slightly, his focus sharpening as he read the clause again, this time with context, this time with intention, and the realization settled fully now. Not as a question, but as fact, and he leaned back slowly, his hand moving away from the document as if creating distance from the decision it represented. And when he finally looked up, his expression had changed, not dramatically, but enough, the certainty replaced by something more measured, more aware, and he turned his head just slightly toward the executive across from him. "You did not flag this," he said, his tone even, but beneath it lay a quiet implication that did not need to be stated, and the executive opened his mouth, then closed it again, searching for a response that would restore control, but nothing came quickly enough, and in that pause, the weight of the moment settled completely, and Richard's attention returned to Ava once more, not as an afterthought, not as an interruption, but as the reason the deal had not just gone through without question, and for the first time. There was something close to respect in the way he looked at her, something unspoken but unmistakable, because she had seen what his entire room had missed, and she had said something when it would have been easier to remain silent. Richard did not reach for the pen again, not immediately, and that absence of motion carried more finality than any signature could have, because the decision had already shifted, quietly but completely, and the men around the table seemed to sense it all at once, their posture changing in small ways that revealed more than words ever would, shoulders easing back, eyes no longer fixed on the document with expectation but drifting instead between Richard and Ava, uncertain now of where the center of the room truly was. and the executive across from Richard adjusted his tie with a subtle, practiced movement, attempting to recover a sense of control that no longer fully belonged to him. But the room did not follow his lead this time, did not return to the easy confidence it had held before, and Richard exhaled slowly, his gaze lowering to the document one last time before he closed it with deliberate care. The sound of paper meeting paper soft but definitive, and when he looked up, again, his attention moved past the men seated at the table and settled once more on Ava, who had stepped back slightly after speaking, her hands now resting lightly at her sides. Her posture unchanged, composed, as if nothing extraordinary had just occurred, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them no longer tense, no longer uncertain, but something steadier, something resolved. And then Richard gave a small nod, not exaggerated, not performative, but real, an acknowledgement that carried weight precisely because it was understated. "Thank you," he said, his voice even, stripped of the edge it had held earlier, and the words landed in the room with a quiet gravity that no one missed, because they were not just gratitude, they were recognition, and Ava did not react beyond a slight incline of her head, a simple acceptance without expectation, without triumph, because she had not spoken for recognition, she had spoken because it was right, and that distinction remained clear in the way she held herself, and Richard's eyes lingered for a second longer, as if committing something to memory, before he turned slightly toward the others. "We are not signing this tonight," he said, and there was no argument this time, no immediate pushback, only a collective understanding that the direction had changed, that what had seemed certain was now open again, and the energy of the room followed that shift, quieter, more measured, and Ava reached for the tray once more, lifting it with the same steady hands, the same quiet precision, as if she were simply continuing her work, as if the moment that had just unfolded did not belong to her. Alone, and she turned to leave, her steps unhurried, the soft sound of her shoes against the polished floor blending into the ambient noise of the restaurant beyond the private room, where life continued without knowledge of what had just changed inside. And as the door closed gently behind her, the light from the hallway spilling in for a brief second before fading again, the room remained still, the air holding onto the echo of what had happened, and no one laughed, no one spoke out of turn. Because something fundamental had shifted, something that could not be undone, and in that quiet, with the document closed and the decision delayed, the absence of sound said everything that needed to be said.